The law of the high alpine is absolute. Above the timberline, the terrain does not negotiate with aluminum or steel. It simply holds what falls. In the Talkeetna Mountains of Alaska, on the steep, rocky slopes of a peak known locally as Bald Mountain, a shattered assembly of silver metal reflects the summer sun. This is not a dump site. It is treated as a memorial and a grave site, surveyed, photographed, and left in place. Our task is simple: document the aircraft's identity and respect the line where 8 men ended their careers. The aircraft resting here is a KB-29P Superfortress, a bomber airframe converted into an aerial tanker to extend strategic air command reach at the height of the Cold War. Locally, hikers and researchers call it Kramer 31. To an untrained eye, the debris can read as random scrap, but the tail structure and heavy wing spars make the identification unmistakable. The wreckage sits high on bare rock, a permanent marker of a loss that occurred decades ago. A persistent error exists in the casual history of this region. Many visitors who hike the Talkeetna Range confuse this site with another wreck located on a nearby ice field. That other wreck is a TB-29 on Bomber Glacier, lost in June 21, 1957. 10 men were on board that aircraft, 4 survived, and 6 were killed. It is a different aircraft, on different ground, in a different year. The Bomber Glacier wreck has been ground down by the movement of ice. The Kramer 31 site on Bald Mountain is different. It sits on stable rock. This stability allows for a much clearer reading of the site. Unlike a glacier ground wreck, this site hasn't been rewritten by moving ice. It is a freeze frame of a single moment in time. This distinction is critical for the surveyor. It means that the position of the heavy components today is almost exactly where they came to rest after the initial energy release. The date of the loss was December 26, 1956. It was the day after Christmas. The weather was typical for an Alaskan winter, characterized by low visibility, driving snow, and biting wind. On that night, there were no survivors. All 8 crew members on board were killed. With no survivors, the mountain never became a rescue scene, only a record of total energy conversion. When we approach the boundary of the wreckage today, we are stepping into a protected zone. The United States government still considers the wreck and any associated remains protected, and removing anything from the site can violate applicable laws and land management rules. While the site is accessible to those with the physical fitness to climb the ridge, the ethical constraints are clear. You may look and photograph. You may document part numbers and corrosion patterns, but you must not take. The mission of this investigation is to map the reality of the Kramer 31 crash site against the historical record. We must understand why a massive 4-engine aircraft capable of flying thousands of miles ended its journey on the side of a mountain only 50 miles from its departure point. The wreckage reads like a routine flight hitting a hard limit. Every fragment is a receipt for a course line that met the mountain first. As we examine the perimeter, we see the consequences of a heavy aircraft meeting a solid object. The wings are severed, the fuselage is largely gone, consumed by the post-impact environment. Yet specific technical details remain. The landing gear struts, the heavy radial engine blocks, and the tail structure provide the forensic anchors we need. They tell us that this was not a structural failure in midair. This was a machine that was flying under power, under control, and with purpose, right up until the moment the mountain intervened. The question we must answer next is not just where it crashed, but why the destruction was so absolute. Why does so little of the forward section remain while the tail sits high on the ridge as if it were still in flight? To understand this, we must look at the cargo this tanker was carrying. The structural destruction of the Kramer 31 airframe was not determined by the impact angle alone. It was determined by the chemical potential energy stored in the wings and the bomb bay tanks. To understand why this wreckage remains on the mountain and why the site is classified as a location where recovery is impossible, we must examine the specific loading of the aircraft. A tanker is essentially a flying reservoir. When it strikes a solid object, it does not merely crumble. It can erupt into a violent fireball and explosion. The mission profile on that December night was a ferry flight from Elmendorf Air Force Base to Eielson Air Force Base. Short by strategic standards, but flown with a heavy fuel load for ballast and readiness. The aircraft had been airborne only 19 minutes, meaning the engines had burned almost none of it. Contemporary summaries describe a full load near maximum capacity. The loss fits controlled flight into terrain, CFIT, a fully functioning aircraft flown under power into unseen rising ground. At cruise speed, 100,000 pounds of aluminum can be shredded by granite, but here the fuel load set the true scale of what came next. Upon impact with the ridge at 4,200 feet, the fuel tanks ruptured. The gasoline did not simply pool and burn. The force of the collision atomized the liquid into a fine mist, mixing it instantly with the surrounding oxygen. This mixture creates the conditions for an extremely rapid, oxygen-fed fireball and a sharp pressure pulse. This is different from a slow, pooled fire. It is a sudden, expanding burn front that can tear structure apart and drive temperatures high enough to destroy thin aluminum skins and wiring. Local accounts from the area later described a flash against the night sky, underscoring how dramatic the event appeared from the ground. The intensity of this thermal reaction created a hard boundary for any potential recovery operation. The forward section of the aircraft, including the cockpit, the navigator station, and the flight engineer panel, was in the center of the reaction zone. The fire did not just damage these sections, it shattered and burned them beyond recognition. Much of the forward structure was reduced to fragmented, heat-damaged pieces and slag scattered into the rock and snow. This is why the recovery of the forward fuselage is not an option. It does not exist in a recoverable form. For the survey team, this creates a distinct separation in the debris field. We are not looking for a complete airplane. We are looking at a gradient of destruction. The nose and the center section represent the zone of total loss, where the combination of impact forces and thermal shock erased the structure. The short hop nature of the flight, which seemingly reduced the operational risk, actually maximized the destructive potential by ensuring the fuel tanks were full. The decision to leave the wreckage on the mountain is therefore not just a matter of logistics, it is a recognition of the physics. There is no fuselage to lift because the energy of the fuel load dismantled it at the molecular level. However, the fire had a physical limit. The thermal bloom could only reach so far before the energy dissipated into the cold winter air. While the front of the aircraft was being consumed, the rear section was subjected to a different set of forces. The tail did not melt, it broke away. And because it broke away, it preserved a piece of engineering that makes this wreck unique among all others in the mountains of Alaska. The distribution of the wreckage on Bald Mountain is not random. It is a calculated result of mass, momentum, and the steepness of the terrain. When we map the site today, we are observing a debris field that is dictated by the angle of the slope. The mountain acts as a mechanical sieve. This creates a specific survey challenge. We cannot view the wreck as a single coherent unit. We must analyze it as a vertical cascade of evidence that stretches over a considerable distance. The primary mechanism at work here is debris field dispersion. On a flat surface, an impact creates a concentric blast radius. But on a grade of this severity, gravity sorts the wreckage based on density. The heavy components, such as the propeller hubs, the reduction gears, and the solidified ingots of melted engine alloy, carry the most kinetic energy. They tumble the furthest, cutting a path through the scree and settling at the lowest points of the field. The lighter structures, specifically the aluminum skin panels and the hollow rib sections, lose their momentum almost instantly against the friction of the rock. They remain clustered near the initial point of impact at 4,200 feet. This separation allows the survey team to reconstruct the breakup sequence by reading the field from top to bottom. The aircraft did not stall and drop. It struck while still moving forward with significant energy, and the slope carried the evidence downhill. The start of this trail, the zero datum of the survey, represents the moment where the navigation solution failed. The crew was operating in conditions that neutralized their ability to see the threat. This is the phenomenon of the whiteout. In the winter of 1956, the snow cover likely blended the sky with the rising terrain, eliminating the horizon line. The pilots were flying in a visual void. The altimeters would have read a correct altitude above sea level, but they provided no warning of the slope rising rapidly to intercept the flight path. The mountains do not move, and when visibility drops to zero, the margin for error vanishes. Surveying this dispersion requires a disciplined grid approach. Because the slope is unstable, walking the site involves a risk of dislodging heavy components that have been balanced on the rocks for decades. We do not move these items. To shift a strut, or a wing spar is to destroy the context of its landing. We document the location of the heavy gear to determine the flight vector. The scattered nature of the smaller fragments confirms the violence of the breakup, but the wide field also obscures the smaller details. On a slope that sorts metal like gravel, you would expect nothing large to survive. Yet at the very top of the field, above the engines that rolled downhill, one massive section broke away cleanly and stayed upright, intact enough to carry answers. The timeline of the 1956 response was defined by a rigid constraint: winter. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, the United States Air Force initiated search and recovery efforts despite the visibility, the wind, and the elevation. Their objective was not the salvage of the machinery, but the recovery of the crew. Once the human cost was addressed, the focus shifted to the hardware, and specifically to the question of identity. The most definitive piece of evidence remaining on the slope is the aerial refueling system. This component confirms that the aircraft was not a standard bomber, but a KB-29P. The distinction lies in the engineering of the fuel transfer mechanism. Earlier tanker variants used simple hoses. This aircraft was equipped with the flying boom. The boom is a rigid, telescoping aluminum tube controlled by an operator in an aft station. It relies on aerodynamic surfaces, known as rotavators, to fly the nozzle into the receptacle of the receiving aircraft. This system allowed for higher fuel flow rates and greater stability than the flexible hose method. On Bald Mountain, the boom structure remains attached to the tail section, extending out over the rocks. Its presence is the physical proof of the aircraft's role. It is a specialized industrial tool that has survived because of its location on the airframe. The survival of the tail section is explained by simple distance and shielding. The main fireball and the most intense heat were concentrated around the wing box and the ruptured fuel system. Fire boundaries are not infinite. They weaken with distance, wind, and time. The tail of the superfortress sat well aft of the wing box, placing it outside the most destructive zone. The fire scorched paint and damaged surfaces, but much of the empennage remained structurally recognizable. This creates a stark visual contrast. The front of the aircraft is a field of ash and slag, while the rear section retains its geometric integrity. This preservation has left a permanent landmark on the mountain. The right horizontal stabilizer was torn loose during the final tumble, but it did not lie flat. It came to rest pointing vertically toward the sky. From a distance, this vertical fin looks like a deliberate marker, a metallic tombstone standing against the gray stone. It is the most recognizable feature of the site. Hikers navigating the ridge often use this vertical stabilizer as a navigation waypoint. It serves as the final confirmation that they have reached the correct location. It is a piece of aerodynamic structure that has been repurposed by gravity into a monument. With the crew recovered and the site identified by the unique boom geometry, the mission shifted from rescue to memory. The Air Force had retrieved its men and confirmed the loss. The question then became what to do with the tons of aluminum that remained on the steep slope. What happened next was a Cold War calculation of utility versus risk. The Air Force could mount a salvage effort, ground parties, limited helicopter support, engineers cutting the airframe into liftable sections, or declare a total loss and withdraw. The decision was driven by the hard operational realities of the Cold War. This aircraft was a tanker, a utility asset, not a one-off prototype packed with uniquely sensitive hardware. Once the crew was recovered and any standard equipment was accounted for, the intelligence value of the debris dropped effectively to zero. The cost and danger of sustaining a retrieval team on a steep, unstable alpine slope far exceeded the scrap value of the raw aluminum. Consequently, the Air Force made the institutional decision to leave the superfortress exactly where it lay. This decision to abandon the airframe in place turned the crash site into an unintended time capsule. For decades, the wreck sat largely undisturbed, visited only by the occasional hunter or mountaineer navigating the Talkeetna range. This preservation allows us to apply the technical principles of forensic identification to verify the history without the need to disturb the evidence. In the discipline of aviation archaeology, positive identification does not require the reassembly of the aircraft. It requires the location of a single, non-transferable data point that links the hardware to the record. This usually comes in the form of a steel data plate riveted to a major structural component or a painted stencil on the vertical stabilizer. On the slopes of Bald Mountain, the post-impact fire likely destroyed many of the forward identification markings that are typically the primary source of identity. However, the survival of the tail section provided enough proof to close the case. Painted markings and stamped part numbers on surviving structure, combined with the distinctive geometry of the refueling boom, matched the aircraft record for serial number 44-84149. This is the core mechanism of forensic identification. We do not need the entire machine to prove the case. We need only enough distinct geometry and surviving markings to rule out all other possibilities. That link ties the physical debris on the slope to the crew manifest and the mission documentation from Elmendorf Air Force Base. The physical condition of the wreck reinforces why the decision to abandon was the correct technical trade-off. The nose is simply gone, reduced to heat-damaged fragments, while the fuel fire stripped skin and lighter alloys, exposing only the heavy steel engine mounts and landing gear trunnions. If a recovery team had attempted to lift the forward fuselage using cranes or slings, the structure would have crumbled. The structural integrity was entirely gone. The only identifiable section was the tail, and hauling a severed tail unit off a mountain for museum display was not a priority for a military force focused on nuclear readiness. By the year 2005, the status of the site had shifted. It was no longer viewed as industrial refuse or a navigation hazard. It had become a recognized destination for hikers and aviation enthusiasts. The local community in Alaska began to treat the site not as a debris field, but as a historical memorial. This shift in perception led to the installation of a permanent marker to honor the 8 men who died there. The decision to leave the aluminum in place had created a permanent monument, but by making the site a known destination, it also exposed the wreckage to a modern threat that the original recovery team had never anticipated. The most significant threat to the long-term integrity of the Kramer 31 site did not come from the crushing weight of the winter snow or the chemical process of corrosion. It came from the very people who hiked the mountain to honor it. There's a contradiction inherent in the modern access to aviation wreck sites. The easier it becomes to find these locations using GPS coordinates and online guides, the more vulnerable they become to disturbance. The aluminum structure of the superfortress had survived the initial impact and 5 decades of exposure, but the specific markers of memory proved to be far more fragile. That same year, a private group of aviation historians and family descendants organized an expedition to the site to install a permanent memorial for the 8 crew members lost in 1956. They bolted a heavy metal plaque to a rock near the tail section, giving visitors a single, deliberate point of focus. This was a deliberate act of stewardship, intended to transform the debris field from a curiosity into a recognized war grave. However, the remoteness of the site offered no security. Sometime after the installation, the plaque was forcibly removed. This was not a casual theft. The marker was heavy, bolted down, and located miles from the nearest road. The removal required tools, planning, and significant physical effort. The theft of a memorial plate from a crash site represents a specific failure of the unwritten code of the backcountry. This act of vandalism triggered a renewed commitment from the local community. In the years that followed, a replacement plaque was fabricated and carried up the slope. This second dedication reinforced the status of the site. It served as a statement that the history of the 508th Air Refueling Squadron would not be erased by the actions of a few individuals. This cycle of installation, theft, and replacement highlights the central challenge of managing a survey-only site. Without a fence or a guard, the protection of the evidence relies entirely on the ethical discipline of the visitor. This reliance on the visitor leads to the governing concept here: in situ preservation. In a museum recovery, objects are removed, cleaned, restored, and stabilized. But the story is stripped away with the context. On Bald Mountain, context is the evidence. Blast patterns on rock, the separation of the tail from the fuselage, and the way heavy components settled on the slope. Leave it in place, and the mountain keeps the data. Under this protocol, the survey team documents the changes in the site over time, but does not intervene to stop the natural decay. We monitor the shift of the heavy engines as the scree slope erodes. We track the fading of the United States Air Force insignia on the fuselage. But we do not paint and we do not stabilize. The goal is to allow the site to exist in equilibrium with the environment. The serial number confirms the story, identifying the machine as the specific tanker that left Elmendorf on that December night, but the scattered wreckage tells the story of the energy that brought it down. The legacy of the Kramer 31 is therefore defined by what remains, not by what was recovered. The body recovery in 1956 fulfilled the moral obligation to the crew. The modern survey and the placement of the memorial fulfill the historical obligation to the record. The wreckage on Bald Mountain serves as a permanent, immovable educational tool. It teaches the physics of energy management, the consequences of navigation error, and the durability of mid-century aerospace engineering. As long as the tail section stands upright against the skyline, the mission of the tanker is preserved. It is a silent, static reminder of the cold logic of the high alpine, where one mistake can turn a routine flight into a permanent feature of the landscape.